All right, welcome everybody. I'm Bill Wiesler. I'm one of your organizers for today's summit. I'm Director of New Ventures in the Office of Cooperative Research, and for the past year I've had the pleasure to also be the Director for the Blavatnik Fund for Innovation at Yale. We're thrilled to have the Blavatnik Fund be a new part of our ecosystem here and already making a lot of impact. So great to have Peter here and see so many of you coming from New York or Boston or even farther afield and joining us here today. Please see all the Yale innovations going on out at our poster session, and for all you Yale folks, this is a great opportunity for you to meet people out in industry. And here's a great group of folks that we've assembled for you to meet. It's my pleasure to introduce our next panel moderator, Domingo Silva, from the law firm of Saul Ewing. Saul Ewing is a valued partner of our office and is a leading sponsor of this summit, so we're grateful for that. Thank you. And I'll let him kick off his panel, Trends in Biotech Investing.
Thank you. Microphone on? I guess it is. Thanks, everybody. As Bill said, the theme of this panel is Trends in Biotech Investing. I had the opportunity to talk about this panel with our panel members, and what we'll try to do here is not only talk about biotech investing and the current trends in the market, but also we'll try to shed some light on the mechanics of investing, what goes into the relationship between an investor and a startup or entrepreneur. So first, we welcome questions during the panel, but make sure to use the microphone because otherwise people will not be able to hear your question. And I believe the microphones are distributed throughout the auditorium, so please just lift your hand and raise your hand and somebody will help you. And I would like to start the panel by basically having each member of the panel introduce him or herself. Starting with Stacey.
Sure. I'm Stacey Seltzer. I'm a partner at Aisling Capital. Aisling is a life sciences focused venture capital and private equity firm. We invest both on the public and private side, investing mainly in biopharma, although a bit in medical devices. We tend to be a later stage investor, so we invest mainly in clinical and commercial stage, although for things like orphan disease and oncology, we will go a bit earlier.
I'm Jason Rhodes. I'm a partner with Atlas Venture, and so Atlas is based in Boston, and we are a biotech-only fund and a largely early-stage fund. And in fact, we found, seed, and incubate the vast majority, about 85% of the companies that we invest in. And we largely only build companies in Boston, but apropos of the last panel, which I thought was very interesting, we actually source intellectual property and science and scientific entrepreneurs from around the world. And so we have a CAR-T company, for example, called Unum that went public recently, where the original technology came out of Singapore. But it's very nice to be here and look forward to the panel.
And I'm Christine Brennan. I am with MRL Ventures Fund, so that's Merck Research Labs. So we are a corporate strategic fund to Merck. By strategic, I mean that we invest in things that Merck is not doing that we think may eventually be of interest to them, or at a minimum is going to feed kind of the knowledge ecosystem of the biotech community. We invest early, so we're seed to IND stage companies, all therapeutic companies, but any therapeutic area and any modality. We're just equity, we don't take any rights, and really the point is to try to get out there and find these things that are new, kind of bleeding edge things that Merck pretty much either can't do or doesn't do right now. We have about 250 million under management, and we typically put in about 15 million over the life of a company.
Hi everyone, I'm Lim Rackleff. I'm a partner at New Leaf Ventures. New Leaf is a life science investment firm. I'm based in New York City, although live in your neighborhood. I actually live in Madison. We invest across the continuum and actually increasingly have moved into earlier stage, so from startup through public. We actually invest out of two different funds. One is a more traditional venture fund, and the other is a crossover and early public fund. and so we can cover the spectrum from startup through early public. We focus about 80% of our efforts in investing in new therapeutics and platforms, and 20% into an area we call information convergence, others would call healthcare IT.
Good morning, I'm Jim Redick. I'm the head of research and new investments at Royalty Pharma, which is a New York-based private equity firm, about $16 billion in assets. We've been around for a little over 20 years. Historically, most of our investing has been to buy royalties, as you might expect from the name. Most of those royalties come from academic or biotech and sometimes pharma sources. So those are usually pre-existing royalties from an invention made at a university and then subsequently licensed and commercialized by a larger company. But increasingly, and maybe we'll talk about this later, we're expanding our business model to look into direct investing into products, sort of asset-based financing, where we're a partner in financing a product through clinical trials to get it to market. But thank you for having me.
And I'm Karen Hong. I'm a partner with Takeda Ventures. Similar to Christine, Takeda is the corporate venture fund. We invest on behalf of Takeda Pharmaceutical. We generally deploy about $50 million a year, split between new investments and the existing portfolio. We invest within the core areas of Takeda's strategic interest. That includes oncology, GI, and neuroscience. We may include more orphan with the pending acquisition. We also will go into platforms, very disruptive platforms that can span therapeutic areas. We will invest as early as concept stage, so 3 to 4 years from the clinic. Typically, it's a syndicated investment model. We say we will lead, co-lead, or follow. We're very flexible. And we are doing a little bit of seed new co-formation as well, where Takeda is the sole funding source.
Great. So to start the discussion, I would like to go back to the title of the panel, which is Trends in Biotech Investing. Behind biotech, there's science. And as we know, the industry tends to concentrate on certain types of science at different points. And a lot of companies are created that dedicated to a certain science, and they may pan out or not. But generally, people tend to have areas that they consider to be hot. So I'd like to ask the panel which areas they think are really hot for investing now, and also give a perspective of what they think will be hot or be very interesting in the next 5 or 10 years. In which direction is the industry going in terms of investing? Anyone can volunteer.
I'll go. Sure, are you on it?
Yep, sure. So I think orphan disease over the past 5 years has kind of morphed into ultra-orphan disease. So what's hot now is investing in these companies that have therapies for diseases with prevalences of 2,000 to 10,000, which was basically unheard of 10 years ago. And then what's over the past 5 years, one of the areas that we've spent a lot of time looking in but haven't made an investment yet is in the microbiome. The whole concept of the microbiome is understanding the gut flora and how those things impact the CNS, impact GI diseases. That's an area we've spent a lot of time in.
Good.
Sure. Yeah, and in a related note, so we've spent a lot of time thinking about gain-of-function gene therapy. So how do you introduce a transgene, presumably where there's some sort of a loss of function? So classic kind of rare diseases, inherited diseases often fall into that category. And so then the question is, which kinds of technologies, at least from a new company creation and investment point of view, which kinds of technologies could provide gain-of-function solutions for which kinds of diseases? And as we sort of mapped out the world, we have at least maybe 4 or 5 companies that kind of play across gain-of-function. And so one approach is mRNA, and so we have a company called Translate that we founded that delivers mRNA using LNPs to the liver or into the lung for CFTR, for cystic fibrosis. We have a company called AvroBio, which is ex vivo lenti gene therapy into stem cells, and then you repopulate the patient and they produce whatever their missing protein was. We have a company called Generation Bio, which is non-viral gene therapy. And so unlike AAV approaches where you can only deliver once because of the immunogenicity, because there's no viral capsid, we're able to deliver multiple times in stack dose. And so that means you can titrate up to the effective therapeutic level in terms of the expression level. What it also means, very interestingly, and again it ties into rare diseases, is that we can actually treat, at least theoretically, the youngest pediatric patients. And as they grow, and in this example, as their liver grows, we can follow them up and continue to dose them. And then presumably they reach adulthood. We get them to a maintenance level, and then we can monitor that. And if the level of expression were to ever subside, we could dose them again. And so the one area that we actually didn't invest in or haven't invested in directly is in the AAV gene therapy space, which is very promising and is already very useful for a range of indications, but does have that redosing limitation, which we viewed as being pretty fundamental. And so in some ways that kind of vignette is, I think, representative of the Atlas approach, which is we follow the science and we think not so much about where the current products are, but what will happen downstream. And I think it's pretty apparent, and we'll see how it really plays out, that all of these replacement protein businesses are likely to be eroded very significantly, I think, by these various kinds of gain-of-function gene therapy approaches. And so we went out and we found scientific investigators and entrepreneurs in each of those sort of technology verticals that I described, and we started new companies around them.
Great, and for us, sort of somewhat similar veins, we're actually in Translate Bio with Atlas, and so that's certainly one of the areas that we definitely think about. What are those new technologies or platforms that can deliver things differently or overcome those problems? We recently did a seed investment in, of all things, a cyclic cell-penetrating peptide company, and CPPs have been around for a really long time, but this is new chemistry to try to really deliver into the cytosol and avoid the endosome and really get early endosome escape to get stuff into the cell where it needs to go. So it's definitely an area that we see importance and that we look hard at. We don't generally invest in a company that is just an orphan disease play. If it is focused on orphan disease internally, but it has a broader platform that can go into other disease areas, that's something that we will do. It's really hard to kind of make that strategic argument for Merck to go into the orphans, since they just really are fundamentally not there at all, at least not right now. Maybe there's acquisitions in our future too, who knows? But right now we sort of really focus on other areas. Inflammation in general and how that immunology really converges with the various different disciplines. Obviously, IO is a big Merck interest. We see everything that's in IO because of that, but we really are looking for what's new and what's different and what's differentiated. But one of the other big places that we spend a lot of time looking is in neuroinflammation, and how can we make neuro really more accessible to discovery and development. And so that's a couple of the core areas for us.
Looks like we might be going down the table side. In terms of what's hot in investing from our perspective, maybe break it down into a couple of categories. One, in terms of therapeutic area and indication. Obviously, oncology continues to be a very big area, and immuno-oncology, as you've all heard and continue to hear, is probably the biggest area in there. I would make a play for old school targeted therapies, old school kinase inhibitors that have brought back some very interesting stories. We're investors in a company called Decipher, which is a next generation kinase platform that overcomes resistance through not binding at the ATP binding site, but actually modulating the kinase differently. And we still like the area of targeted therapies, patient selection, et cetera. So it wasn't very popular 2-3 years ago, but I think immuno-oncology in general is experiencing a little bit of a moment of correction, perhaps, and we'll see the old school targeted therapies, I think, still playing a role. In neuroscience is my background, an area of continued interest for us. As investors, we are very cautious and selective, but continue to make investments in a range of neuroscience settings where we believe there's a tractable path forward. It is sobering to reflect on a decade of total failure in Alzheimer's disease in clinical development. And what's most concerning is whether that will actually create a barren wasteland for Alzheimer's disease, as happened for acute stroke in the 90s. that is still a concern. We have not invested in an Alzheimer's company, although we've looked at many. And thankfully, we didn't invest in any of them. But it is an area of continued interest, of course, and one of the biggest unmet need areas. In terms of modalities, I'd say gene therapy is having a moment right now across all the avenues and approaches that Jason mentioned. We're actually about to invest in a platform gene therapy company for neuroscience indications. And it is an area that's attracting a lot of interest broadly and across multiple different therapeutic indications. Cell therapy, Jason mentioned Unum is a company we also invested in. Next generation CAR T therapies across actually a range of non-oncology as well as oncology indications. So these are proving to be quite exciting, but also challenging in terms of becoming products. And I'd say a shout out for another company here in New Haven, and that is Arvinas, and this whole area of targeted protein degradation as a novel therapeutic modality. There's certainly heightened interest in protein degradation, and I think Arvinas is one of the leading companies in the space, but I think there's been, in the last year, another 4 additions to protein degradation platforms. So as a platform therapeutic modality, we're seeing a lot of more interest in protein degradation, which is extremely exciting space. And I'll stop there and pass on down the table.
It is harder to be at this end of the table. Sorry. You're taking now. No, I'd say we intersect with a few hot technologies. We're generally a later stage investor because many of our traditional investments have been on royalties on products that are on the market, but as I said before, we're creeping earlier stage, and therefore, paying more attention to some of the trends. I'd say particularly in oncology, I think all of my examples are from oncology, where we spend a good bit of our time. But 2 areas to start off are interesting with respect to overcoming resistance. So, you do, as exciting as IO is and checkpoint therapies are, there are still patients who don't respond or who relapse. So what is it about them that causes them to relapse, and how do you supplement or combine with those checkpoint therapies to drive responses? And there are a lot of interesting approaches that are now, I think probably the highest profile one recently was the Nectar IL-2 product. Is a pegylated IL-2, but Bristol Myers, at least, I actually think this is pretty hot, sought-after license from other companies, but Bristol Myers licensed that product to use with Opdivo and to supplement their checkpoint inhibitor. So it'll be very interesting to see where they go and what is possible there. And other companies, Armo has a really interesting approach, we think, also with an anti-IL-10 antibody, also looking at kind of what's not taken care of, particularly PD-L1 negative patients and tumor mutation burden high patients. So those will be interesting places to watch in the overcoming resistance in combination with checkpoint field. And I was going to say Arvinas also, because I think that overcoming mutations or mutated targets is interesting. And I do think that that approach of degrading the protein itself is a very interesting way to overcome, for example, escape mutations with androgen receptor. We have a royalty in Xtandi, so we're watching that very closely. But that is certainly an increasing unmet need in terms of mutated targets. So still an interesting target area. And then cellular therapies, I think, are very interesting. CAR T and all the new versions of CAR T. And I think Fred Cohen, we were chatting last night about his new investment with the allogeneic approach with what I guess originated with Selectis but went through Pfizer. But I think that's a fascinating approach. I think if cellular therapies can be made to be off the shelf and more productized in a conventional sense, as opposed to something that resembles kind of a bone marrow transplant and is sort of complicated and comes with some of the complications that come along with that, that'd be very interesting. So we're really watching that space. And then our most recent investment was in an ADC, antibody drug conjugate a company called Immunomedics, and they have a triple negative breast cancer product going through the clinic right now. It's called IMU 132, and we just put $250 million into finishing the development of that product and expanding it into some other indications. We think ADCs are still interesting after having been worked on for a while, but there are ways to make them safer and more effective that are worth following.
Just to close the topic, I think that if you look at Takeda's both BD and investment behavior in the last 2 years, they've been doing a lot of what is called modality diversification. So Takeda started out as a small molecule focused pharmaceutical company, and they've brought in biologics, they've brought in gene therapy, they've brought in bispecifics, ADC, all sorts of modality diversification, which has been trying to open up the target space to bring on new effector function. The internal discussion that's going on right now is that now we have all these world-class tools and we have all these approaches, but we lack targets. So still it comes down to really deep understanding of disease pathology, and it really comes back to an academic professor who spent 15 years studying a pathway. And that model still works, I think. That's still a scarcity, is really high quality targets.
Great, so we heard that there are so many fields out there that are hot right now, and people are struggling to come up with, to turn research into a product, something that can reach the market. How many people here are researchers? Okay, so the majority of the people here. And one thing we see all the time from the outside is that people create startups, and sometimes you do have multiple startups that they're based on similar science. And they all seem very similar, and yet what you read in the news is that some of these people take off and some people don't. And a lot of it has to do with lack of investment. And to an outsider, it looks like a black box because you can't really figure out why this happened, why people choose to invest in one company and not to invest in another. So I was wondering if the panel could elaborate a little bit on the kind of experience they have in terms of dealing with startups and which ones they choose to invest in and which ones they don't, and what is the distinguishing factor, what makes them special, that special company you want to deal with. So maybe Christine?
Sure. So, of course, the basis of all this is the science, right? And having that really exciting new insight. What's the unmet need? How are you solving? And how are you differentiated from anything that's out there right now or that came before? But that's one actually fairly small piece when you look at trying to form a company. You really need to understand how have the view and the sight line to what do you need in terms of money, and what are those milestones to really prove out whatever that science is. And so having a really good team around that is really huge. And so for us, when we look at anything new, we really look at both we need to get excited about the science. We need to understand how it's differentiated. We need to understand why this is something that can be transformative. But in the same vein, because we aren't right now doing company startups, and I'll let Jason talk to how he thinks about forming this, we really want to see who else is around this table and who is going to help really form this and deliver on the promise of this technology. And then, of course, there's the finance piece of it, and we really need to understand that. What is it going to take? Who else can we get excited about this to really syndicate this deal? And do we play well with those people? And do we have a like-minded vision of what the company, at least as we start it, is going to be? Things always change as you get data. But those are the three pillars that we generally focus on. It's the science, it's the team, and it's the sort of overall financing view to get to those kinds of really good, interesting companies that we think are going to make it.
Jason, do you want to comment?
Sure. I guess maybe make a couple observations and what it means for us in terms of startups. So one observation would be, as an industry, we only create something like 100 to 125 new biotechs a year. And it's been remarkably flat for a very long time. So in almost any economic space, if there's an increase in demand, there's an increase in supply, right? Supply is elastic. It's essentially inelastic in biotech. So why is that? Well, there are actually more and more, I think, good ideas, great science matched to new therapeutic modalities that are well reduced to practice that can be converted, or you can translate science into products. So it's not lack of sort of a scientific foundation. And in fact, the dollars going into biotech very clearly are increasing. So what we're actually seeing is the same number of companies, but at least some subset of them are very, very well capitalized. So that's kind of one observation. The other observation, I think, is that whenever we have a new modality, whether it's antibodies once upon a time, which are no longer new but are very effective, or CAR-Ts or AAV or mRNA, we always have multiple entrants. And I think the same thing is true around any biological pathway or target. There were multiple PI3K companies, there are multiple kinase companies, and science comes in waves. And what we're doing is sort of observing all the time and talking to folks like you and trying to figure out which wave is real and which one to jump on, and then with who to jump on it. And so I think you actually want to see multiple companies in a given space. It would be a little bit, you'd pause. If you were the only one, maybe you're the only one with that insight, but you would want to think very hard about why. Maybe you're just early, and that would be fine too, but if you're early, you'd want to understand why, what aspects of the biology are unknown, because biology exists and it's immutable. We just don't know a lot of it, and it reveals itself to us over time, and that's fundamentally what we do in research. So with all of that said, what we do when we're creating new companies, whether they're very large platform companies like these gene and cell therapy companies that we were talking about, or much more product-oriented companies going after a given target or pathway, we obviously diligence the science. We try to work with very strong scientific investigators who could be founders or entrepreneurs, or they may stay in their institution. But then what we do, and again echoing Christine, we try to assemble very high-quality teams very quickly, because execution is how high-performing companies separate from the pack. And on the one hand, it's a tautology, I guess, but it's also completely true, right? And so we never look at a company and say, gosh, we hired this great team into it very early, and that was the problem.
Right.
You know, so that's almost never our sort of post-mortem diagnosis. But if you bring in great teams, you actually figure out whether the science is real, and if it's real and tractable and can be converted and translated into an industrial drug discovery process, then that team can execute on. Part of that is to recognize that the sort of core science and biology is necessary, but really quite insufficient, that ultimately we're making products. And so you go from early research and lead discovery, et cetera, depending on the modality, into preclinical development. And then where a lot of companies stumble is when they go into clinical translation, because a research view of the world can be, not to ascribe this to anyone, although I've made this mistake, it can be that once you get to the development candidate that you're kind of done. You've got the drug molecule, you kind of hand it off to a development team, and those folks run downstream. And early development is often where the biology really, in a human setting, starts to reveal itself to you. And so making sure that you've anticipated what your translational development looks like, what kind of biomarkers you want to collect in your phase one. It's really a bummer when you do your phase one, you get unexpected results, and then you didn't collect the data to sort of deconvolute those outcomes. Like, I've been there too, and it's a bad, bad day.
Yes.
So build strong translational teams, and I'll end there.
Good. Are there any questions from the audience at this point? I think we have a question right there. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think of the next big things in cancer immunotherapy? You play enough like PD-L1, right? So any new novel targets or combinations?
Well, I could go. So yes and yes. There's always new targets. There's always combinations. I mean, oncology is always a combination play, right? I think it's really a lot of the biology is starting to be unwound around the tumor microenvironment, and what are the true key players in really allowing that tumor to mask itself and to evade the immune system. So there's a lot of focus now that I've seen on macrophages and B cells, and there's been a gigantic focus on T cells, appropriately so, but there are other immune cells that do play a role. So I'm seeing a renewed focus in some of these other players, along with trying to figure out what are those other targets that are either the gas or the brake in the tumor microenvironment, along with other more sort of next generation CARs that are coming out. We're looking at a company right now that's a CAR macrophage instead of a CAR T. And then there's the what are they calling it? The supra CARs now. There's a whole new additional complicated that I don't understand way that they're adding additional parts into the CAR to be much more specific. So all of that is definitely kind of the next steps. But I think one of the key ones is really just trying to figure out what are the gas, what's the brake, and what are the tools that we can use to play in there to really make that tumor microenvironment more favorable for us for curing the cancer than it is for the tumor.
Yeah, I'll just build on that because I think from a clinical development perspective, one of the enablers that I think is emerging now is actually identifying a priori the patients who would respond to your particular modality or target. And one of the concerns that I think that's happened within the immuno-oncology space with PD-1 and such is it moved back, oncology moved back to a prior era of empiricism as opposed to rational selection and use of selected patients and very biomarker-rich setting. It kind of went back to empiric combinations and really quite difficult to predict who's going to respond and even how you measure response. I think that's changing now and is a real enabler because it's goes to the capital efficiency of the whole system. It has chewed up a lot of resource. I think it's something like 40 or 50% of capital being invested in biotech goes into oncology, and immuno-oncology is taking up almost all of that now. So it's become this huge enterprise, but quite inefficient if you look at it through a lens of rational drug development. I do believe that is changing.
Yeah, I would agree with that also. I mean, we talk about innovation in the forms of technology, of the biology, but there's also innovation in, measurement. So, early screening and, measurement of, minimal residual disease and measurement of response. So we kind of await innovations there that I think will, make clinical development more precise and perhaps shorter. And another way to potentially make it more efficient would be adaptive clinical trials. It's been very tricky so far because the FDA has not given a huge amount of guidance on what they want out of or how you can modify a trial design kind of midstream. But I think it's increasingly accepted, and there are a couple of approaches that seem to be working and are used by pharmaceutical companies. I mean, Pfizer just announced on their conference call recently that they're expanding one of their Ibrance adjuvant trials by 1,000 patients or something like that midstream. So it does happen, and they're getting more power, and they're going to finish the trial sooner. But that's a very interesting. So pharma can definitely do it from a small company perspective. They should also think about how to screen faster and maybe fail faster. Nobody loves to fail, but as long as you're doing it fast, then it's not that it doesn't increase your burn that much. But you can learn a lot by looking at trials midstream and then adjusting as long as it has a statistical rigor. So we're all sort of working out how to do the statistical rigor.
So going back to I'm not sure if there are other questions. Yes. Yes, we're going to have questions at the end. And also after the session, we have lunch, so people from the panel will be available to talk to.
I actually have a question. Sorry. Here.
Oh.
There you are.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
So I was wondering, one thing I didn't hear from the panel, and maybe they can elaborate on it, is any interest from VCs in investing in antibacterials and anti-infectives. So I know Stacey mentioned about microbiome. So maybe Kristen can talk about it a little bit with Merck's, history on that. But I know for last couple of years, a lot of the big pharmas are kind of exiting anti-infectives and antibacterials. So can we expect maybe a resurgence on that next couple of years with microbiome coming into the fold?
So I think the anti-infective space in general has had ebbs and flows of interest. I think, when I started in venture 10 years ago, nobody was interested in it. Then about 5 years, there became a lot of interest as you saw some exits. Gram-negative programs became very hot. I think with all of the consolidation in the space and some of the big players actually moving out and reimbursement just being so hard, and the most recent launches of some of the drugs like Gerada's dalbavancin didn't go as well as planned. A few other drugs didn't launch very well. I think people are having trouble making a commercial model that supports the amount of money you need to invest in many of these more traditional gram-negative and gram-positive drugs. There's some companies there's a company that just announced interim that they're going public, and they have an oral carbapenem, and it'll be interesting to see, just as a test case, how that does in this kind of IPO market. The microbiome's kind of a different story. It's a different way to address both diseases like recurrence of C. diff, but it's also for autism, for IBD, all sorts of other areas. So I think microbiome is kind of in its own category, and I don't think we'll follow the rules of what we've seen in the anti-infective space.
Yeah, I think it's hard for traditional antibacterials to sort of break out of their sort of a paradox of success, which is there's an assumption, which I'm not sure bears out in clinical development, that preclinical models are predictive. It's the same pathogen, you put it in a mammalian system, you get a result. But we actually find that you need to go into these very large, expensive, slow clinical trials to try to pick signal out, and that can actually be hard to do. So that's one issue. And then the paradox of success, I think, is if you make it, I think there's real reticence for good sort of public policy and medical practice reasons to move novel agents into frontline use, because you worry about developing resistance. So if you make it all the way through that labyrinth, you then get held in reserve potentially. And so maybe part of the microbiome question is also, are there other modalities that can kind of break the model? So phage is very interesting, right? And some real success at Yale recently around that, which I think is fascinating. And so maybe there's some approaches that are a little bit orthogonal like that don't necessarily have the same, at least obvious, risks around generating resistance that can come in. But it is a really challenging one. And to me, it does seem like it's one of those therapeutic areas, and maybe it's the only one, where there probably, and there is, I think, real public policy support for it, because the typical commercial rules don't really incent novelty there the way they do in most other therapeutic areas.
Yeah, and I'll just build onto that. I mean, there was a CRISPR-Cas3 company that got funded recently down in North Carolina that's using this different modality to attack the infectious disease space. But it is a really difficult one from an investor perspective, because you really can't, we're not necessarily completely financially driven, but for those that are more financially driven, it's really hard to sit there and look at an ID investment and say, I'm going to get the kind of exit here that I need, because there aren't that many acquisition parties that are left, and even doing your IPOs, they do okay, but they don't necessarily do extremely well. So there's a sort of a venture financial part of this that makes it difficult. And for those of us that are corporates, even though it is something of interest to Merck from a therapeutic area, I do still have to make money at some point. So we do have a little bit of that. But again, I think it is something that's harder to get to that point where you know that you have something that's going to be rewarded from the system in general.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think this is something that as investors we have completely wrong. Because infectious disease is still a big killer, and actually we're all at risk. Mm-hmm. And the resistance that's coming, that's here already on gram-positives, but it's coming here on gram-negatives, is extremely scary. We should all be frightened. I think the issue is, as has been stated already, that as a society we do not want to pay. We're not willing to pay for drugs that cure life-threatening disease in 7 or 10 doses. We're just not willing to pay for it, and hence the innovation is not being driven financially. This is wrong. It's absolutely wrong for us, for all of us, and it has to change. The public markets really hate antibiotics right now, and I think there's some reason for it, but it's just wrong. and hopefully it will change.
Yes, there's a question.
Hi, Laura Zhu from LifeMax. We're a biotech company in Palo Alto. So gene therapy is very much in the spotlight, especially for orphan diseases. So my question is for those of you who are interested in investing in orphan diseases. What's your position on enzyme replacement, protein replacement therapy, not just for lysosomal storage or disorder or other mitochondrial disorders? Is it falling out of fashion from an investor perspective? Thank you.
I mean, we're also investors in AVROBIO, so we're big fans of protein replacement and lysosomal storage disorders. We also have taken a bet on the AAV side. We're investors in Audentes, which is going for Krigler-Najjar, which is an extremely ultra-orphan disease, as well as a couple other slightly larger ones. And these are all basically protein replacements, some defective gene added back, and hopefully the patients will, especially those with life-threatening pediatric diseases, will have a quality of life and be able to survive. I see so many of these right now in the early stages. Many of them are too early for us because we really like to invest when they're either close to the clinic or in the clinic. But you have companies like coming out of the woodwork, like Orchard, who is has raised a reasonable amount of money and is planning to raise a ton more. They have 53 patients in ADA SCID, which is a tiny disease, and that goes out, I think, something like 7 years worth of patients. And they just acquired a portfolio of 2 other programs where they have significant data in a multi-year, 7 or 10 patients each. I think they're very attractive to the market right now on the investor side, especially since you have a lot of clinical validation. So you may be changing diseases, but at the base of it, you're either betting on lentivirus and adding a cassette to lentivirus, and then the biology of the disease, if it's protein replacement, makes a lot of sense, or you're betting on the AAV and adding a gene in that way. And it's all about fitting the right disease to the right type of gene therapy, because some where you have actively dividing cells, AAV makes no sense because that'll be diluted out over time. In other places where the cells don't divide, AAV is a much easier path to potentially curing a disease.
One of the things that we think is exciting about gene therapy, so there's this conversion of all these exogenous protein replacements into sort of endogenous ones, right, as we were just talking about, as you were describing. And that's happening in front of us right now. What's really interesting is to imagine that an antibody for Alzheimer's works. So I'll put myself in the optimistic camp for the sake of this scenario, wherever you might fall on it. If it works, there's no way we can possibly produce enough antibodies to treat broad populations. Right? We've never produced antibodies on that kind of a basis before. So that's going to be another paradox, right, that we're going to run into. So one way you'll do that is you'll give people gene therapy and you'll get them to produce their own light and heavy chains and produce their own antibodies. But you can't fit those components inside an AAV capsid today. There's not enough room, right? You have 4.5 kb limitation, whatever it is. And you can only give it to someone once. And so what if you don't get an adequate, titer, so to speak? So I think we're in this sort of generation 1.5 of gene therapy, which is really exciting and which is working and creating a lot of new drugs and creating a lot of, success for companies. And I think it's fun to start thinking about what does gene therapy kind of 2.0 or 3.0 look like when we start putting kind of multigenic constructs into people that have not only the transgene but a regulatory element where we produce antibodies to treat infectious disease on a broad basis, et cetera. So those are some of the areas that we're beginning to also look into.
I think we have one question here.
We have one over there with the microphone already.
My question, I'm with the Alpha One Foundation, and we have
The microphone.
Ken Irvin, I'm with the Alpha One Foundation. We have a venture philanthropy effort. What do you see the role of the new disease venture philanthropy groups, CF, ALS, in working with yourselves? Do you see partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see partnerships. You know, we mentioned briefly Translate Bio, which has this mRNA for their first indication, cystic fibrosis, and they're working very, very closely with Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, not only to because there's grant money and whatnot, but also just access to the expertise, access to the patients, really being able to reach out to those patients in a very concerted way. The foundations live this every day, and when you're trying to, you know, especially in something like CF where there's a couple of trials going on, you need to be able to figure out how to do that, especially for limited patient populations. So I think it's a very important part of the collaboration in the venture and company creation space.
I think I'm sorry for the people who have questions to ask, but I think we have to wrap up the session. As I said, lunch will follow, so you have a chance to talk to the panel on a one-to-one basis. As closing remarks, I'd like to thank the panel for taking part in this discussion. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Dominguez and the panel. We really appreciate your insights and your time. And Dominguez is right. There's time out in the courtyard to go ahead and ask more questions. So now we're kicking off our e-posters and our lunch session. Vote for the best e-poster. There's a couple ways. You have a QR code on the back of your name tag. You can go to a website. There's some other cards out there. Vote for your best tech and biotech. We're starting promptly at 12:30 for our pitch contest. That's a great big event that we have in the afternoon. It's one of our keynotes. So we look forward to seeing you back then.